The land was cold long before the storm arrived. Across the wide, frozen valleys of Ice Age Europe, a small group of Neanderthals moved slowly along a wind-blasted ridge. They wore layered hides, stitched tightly with sinew, and kept stone tools tied at the waist. Their breath fogged in the pale light. These people did not speak much. They had learned to listen, to the air, to the quiet, and to each other. The signs were everywhere: frost along the inside of the shelters, birds flying lower, and the slow retreat of prey animals to the south. The men gathered wood from beneath the snow. Women scraped sinew from bone. Children helped gather kindling and dried moss. One elder traced lines in the dirt, marking the direction of herds. Fire crackled near the camp center, but the warmth did not reach far. In the distance, a wall of grey cloud moved steadily. Snow would come soon, heavy and deep. Every action now mattered. The shelters were patched. Spears were checked for damage. Hides were folded, ready for sleep. In the wind, they could already hear the voice of the storm, not yet near, but never far. As the wind settled into a steady rhythm, the Neanderthal camp grew quieter. Sparks rose from the fire, disappearing into the black sky. Somewhere beyond this ancient cold, you're listening, maybe with headphones, or just letting the voice carry through a quiet room. If you're watching this from Berlin, perhaps you're just starting your day, breakfast nearby. In Nairobi, the sun may be high and the air warm outside your window. And if you're lying in bed in Tokyo, eyes drifting shut, let this story carry you gently into sleep. Wherever you are, I'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It helps me imagine the world around this story. And if this calm moment brings you comfort or curiosity, consider subscribing. It helps me continue making these quiet journeys into the past. For now, we return to the cold, where the Neanderthals sit in silence. When the first flakes fell, no one was surprised. The children stopped talking. The hunters moved closer to the fire. The women tightened the hide coverings around the shelters. Snow touched every surface, layering slowly across tools, stones, and the skin of sleeping animals. The Neanderthals stayed quiet, their eyes fixed on the edges of the camp, where light faded into white. Firelight painted long shadows behind them. One man checked the haft of his spear again, fingers numb. Another passed warmed stones to a young girl curled inside a hide blanket. The elder watched the clouds, face unmoving. There was nothing to do now but wait. Meat had been dried. Fat had been rendered. Roots were buried in pits beneath the snow. Their world was not empty. It was waiting. The silence held weight, like a held breath. Somewhere beyond their view, mammoths would be pushing through snowdrifts, and reindeer would huddle against icy ridges. But here, at this fire, the band of hunters did not speak. They simply endured. Each person knew that after the storm passed, hunger would return. The cold never left for long. It only paused to let them remember it. Morning returned slowly, with a sky the colour of steel and snow still falling in thin sheets. One of the young men stepped out from the shelter's mouth, wrapped in fur, his breath curling upward. He squinted at the pale horizon and knelt beside the tracks left the day before. They were nearly gone, covered by wind and snow, but still enough to read. He called softly, and two others joined him, each carrying spears with fire-blackened tips. Together, they moved along the edge of a shallow ravine, careful not to disturb the powdery layer of snow. Every print they found was a clue: split hooves, broken twigs, a smear of yellow urine from a frightened reindeer herd. The trail was 2 nights old. They would need to move soon if they hoped to intercept it. Back at camp, the others worked in silence, scraping hides, tying bundles, shaping points with hammerstones. No one needed to ask what came next. This was the rhythm they lived by: gather, prepare, follow, return. The storm was easing, but not the cold. The hunt would begin tomorrow. Today, they watched, listened, and committed the land to memory. Each mark in snow was a whisper of survival. Inside the largest shelter, Two women tended to an older man whose leg bore the marks of an old injury. He had once been a hunter too, but now moved slowly, wrapped in hides that had darkened from years of use. One woman passed him a warmed bone filled with thick fat. The other adjusted the fur around his shoulders, careful not to speak. He watched the children beside the fire, their faces lit by flickering orange, their fingers busy shaping bits of bark into pretend tools. In this small space, the breath of many people mingled, warm, heavy, real. The shelter was built from the ribs of a mammoth, layered with stitched hides and thick moss. It was more than a barrier from wind. It was a memory chamber. Every patch told a story. Every scar on the bones reminded them of a hunt that fed the group. Outside, the snow muffled sound. Inside, everything was movement, quiet, steady, alive. The injured man blinked slowly and whispered a single word to the nearest child. The child listened. In this world, even the old had roles to play. Even the quietest voice carried knowledge the cold could not erase. As the day faded again, the band gathered close around the central fire. The storm had passed, leaving a glittering layer of ice across the plain. Beyond the camp's edge, reindeer tracks cut briefly through snowdrifts before disappearing into the brush. It was almost time to follow. But for now, they sat in the red light of burning wood, their backs curved, their faces still. The children were quiet. The hunters sharpened stone blades with soft scraping sounds. One woman braided cord from sinew, her hands practiced and calm. The elder watched them all, his breath steady, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. Around them, the earth exhaled. Cold air swept through the trees and stirred the smoke, then settled again. They knew this calm would not last. The hunger would come back. The herds would grow harder to find. But for this moment, everything held still. And you, watching now, might be listening from a bright kitchen in Berlin, or a quiet bed in Tokyo, or a shaded porch in Nairobi. If so, leave a comment and let me know. It helps more than you know. And if you subscribe, it helps me keep telling these forgotten stories. The storm passed, but its weight lingered in the drifts that covered the land. At first light, the Neanderthal band emerged slowly from their shelters. The ground was crusted white, broken only by the dark lines of trees and distant ridges. The hunters gathered near the fire, their clothing stiff with frost, their breath curling in the air. It was time to follow the herds. 2 scouts had found the edge of a reindeer trail the day before, heading southeast toward a narrow valley. The group packed quickly, stone-tipped spears, hide bundles, flint blades, and wrapped fat for energy. There were no spoken plans, just glances and nods. They moved single file, following the low ground where snow collected in hollows. Each step was deliberate. One man paused at a fresh set of tracks. A hare had passed recently, bounding fast. The trail of the herd was harder to read, but they found it in bent grasses and trampled snow. The path led away from shelter, deeper into open country where the cold was sharper. They would not return until the hunt was done and the meat was carried home. Each member knew the risk, but they moved forward. The valley opened before them like a frozen corridor. Wind raced down the slopes, driving snow into eddies that danced between the stones. The Neanderthals kept low, using boulders and the shape of the land for cover. Their pace was steady. Eyes scanned the horizon, watching for movement. Across the valley floor, faint prints crossed an icy stream. Reindeer. Dozens, maybe more. The herd had passed through recently. One hunter knelt beside a hoofprint, pressed into slush and edged with a crust of ice. He placed his fingers alongside it, measuring depth. The animals were heavy. That meant they were feeding. That meant they might stop nearby. They continued, leaving few signs of their passage. Where the ground dipped, they stepped carefully to avoid breaking the crusted snow. Where the ice stretched flat, they moved across in a crouch. Ravens circled above a low hill ahead. Another sign. The Neanderthals did not speak. Their silence was not fear, but function. Every sound carried far in the cold. One man gestured toward a stand of trees near the hill's edge. They would climb and watch from there. If the herd was still close, They would know by nightfall. The climb was slow but careful. Each hunter tested the footing before shifting weight, using bare stone where possible to avoid leaving tracks. At the crest, they crouched beneath the trees. Below them, the valley widened again, and through gaps in the branches they spotted the herd. Dozens of reindeer moved across the far edge of the plain, their hooves kicking powder into the air. Young ones stayed in the middle, flanked by adults with heavy antlers. This was the sign they needed. The hunters did not rush forward. Instead, they observed, watching how the herd moved, where it paused, and which direction the wind carried. They tracked the feeding pattern, where lichen had been scraped from rock, where the snow was trampled. Their advantage was not speed, but memory. The older man among them had hunted this valley before. He traced a line in the snow, pointing to a narrow gully that curved toward the herd's path. It was a natural funnel. If timed right, they could guide the herd toward it and strike with spears from above. Plans did not need words. Their eyes met, and the group began to descend again, each man holding his weapon tight. The route toward the gully was treacherous. Ice coated the upper rocks, and shallow snow hid uneven ground. The Neanderthals moved with practiced caution, crouching low as they crossed open stretches. One man stumbled and fell silently into a drift, rising with snow clinging to his arms. They paused beneath a low outcrop and waited. The reindeer remained unaware. The herd was large, but the group would not try to bring down many. One animal, properly struck, could feed the band for days. More would only go to waste. As they moved into position, they adjusted their spears, checking the balance, retying bindings, wiping snow from stone blades. The gully curved sharply to the east, forming a narrow pass between two low ridges. It was the kind of feature these hunters had used before. The plan was simple. One man would circle wide to spook the herd toward the funnel. The others would wait above, hidden behind stone and bush. When the animals entered, there would be only a few heartbeats to strike. Each hunter reviewed the steps silently. No signals were needed. Every man knew his place, shaped by seasons of tracking, waiting, and surviving in this frozen world. From the ridge, the hunters could see the herd begin to shift. The flanker had reached his position, just visible as a shape moving along the far edge of the trees. He lifted one arm, then dropped it. The signal was enough. A low grunt from his throat stirred the animals, followed by a sudden movement in the brush. The reindeer startled. Their heads turned as one, and the lead animals bolted toward the gully. Snow scattered beneath their hooves. The others followed. Within moments, the herd was running straight into the narrow pass. The hunters tensed. One stood and hurled his spear. Another followed a second later. Stone tips met flesh with a sharp, final sound. A young buck collapsed mid-stride, legs folding beneath it. Another stumbled, wounded, then limped beyond reach. The herd rushed past, vanishing into the valley. But the hunters stayed still, watching the snow settle. Below them, the first body lay in a pool of red spreading across the white. No one cheered. One man descended slowly, approaching the fallen animal. He knelt, placed a hand on its side, and exhaled. The hunt had succeeded. Now came the harder part, bringing it home. The hunt was not possible without the work done long before it began. Long before the first track was found, the Neanderthals shaped the tools they would need. In the days between storms and after smaller hunts, the band gathered stones from riverbeds and cliff edges, looking for pieces with the right weight and fracture lines. Flint was preferred. It broke predictably and held an edge sharp enough to cut sinew or pierce hide. Along the ridge, one man sat cross-legged before a flat stone, a large flint core in his lap. With a rounded hammerstone, he struck the core at an angle, sending flakes away in clean, curved pieces. Each strike followed the memory of hundreds before it. Nearby, another man trimmed a flake's edge with careful pressure from a piece of antler. The blade was forming, a thin crescent, sharp as bone. Women and older youths sorted usable flakes and cleaned them in snow. Some would be fixed to spears, others used for cutting or scraping. Nothing was wasted. A broken piece could still split fat wood or scrape hides. In this cold world, the stone was not just a weapon. It was a memory, passed from hand to hand. Beside the tool makers, another group worked with different materials. Bone and antler were shaped into points, wedges, and handles. These tools were slower to make, but lighter to carry. One woman soaked reindeer sinew in water and twisted it between her fingers. As it dried, it would shrink and harden, becoming a natural cord strong enough to bind stone to shaft. A man nearby scraped fat onto a piece of fire-hardened wood, then pressed the new flint point into a carved notch. He wrapped the joint with wet sinew and smeared resin from birch bark along the seam. This would dry in the cold air and hold fast. Young members of the group sat quietly nearby, watching each movement. The making of a single spear could take hours. The result had to survive impact, wind, and cold. Each weapon was personal, shaped to the size and grip of its owner. Before the next hunt, every spear was checked, rebound, and sometimes reworked from older shafts. They were not disposable. These tools followed their owners through years and seasons. If one broke in a hunt, the failure was remembered. And if it struck true, it was used again. The camp held a designated space for tool making, away from sleeping areas and food preparation. Stone flakes scattered the ground in a shallow arc, and discarded cores marked where previous work had taken place. Tools were not made randomly. Each had purpose, and each followed a familiar form. Scrapers had wide edges for removing fat and hair from hides. Awls were made from bone, sharpened into points to pierce through leather. Some tools were repaired again and again, their edges reflaked until too small to hold. Then they were replaced. A young Neanderthal boy knelt beside a pile of discarded flakes, mimicking the motion of pressure flaking with a stick. One elder watched him quietly, then passed over a real shard to handle. Knowledge passed like this, without lecture, without instruction. It came through repetition and the slow shaping of the hands. The best stoneworkers rarely spoke while they worked. Their focus remained on the surface of the core, reading its structure, deciding where to strike next. Wind swept across the work area, carrying off ash and dry snow. Still they worked, preparing not for display, but survival. These pieces of stone would shape life and death in the days ahead. Beyond the core toolmaking, more specialized items were made for particular uses. Thicker bone shards were carved into digging tools for prying up frozen roots. A sharpened rib from a horse could split hide without tearing it. Antler tines were cut and sanded against rough stone to form needles. These were threaded with sinew to repair clothing and bindings. Some of the women used shell fragments or tooth blades for finer scraping, especially when working thinner hides for foot wraps. One older man sat apart, preparing pitch from birch bark. He placed strips of bark in a small stone bowl, then covered it with a flat rock and set it over a fire. Black pitch oozed out slowly from one side. This sticky substance was used to seal bindings, repair cracks, and attach blades. The technique was known, not explained. Each generation had seen it done, remembered it, and did it again. In the cold world they lived in, nothing was truly new, only remade. The tools did not carry names, but they carried trust. Before night came, every blade would be inspected, every shaft realigned. In the snow-covered valleys, mistakes could not be afforded. Tools made today would decide what tomorrow brought. As evening approached, the tool-making slowed. Completed spears were stacked beside shelters, their bindings dry and tight. Smaller blades were packed in hide wraps and tucked near the fire. The children were called back from play. A woman stirred boiled fat in a stone bowl, dipping strips of dried meat to soften them for eating. A man rubbed a flint edge across a scrap of leather to smooth it, testing the tool's sharpness with his thumb. Around the fire no one celebrated. There were no ceremonies, only readiness. The wind pressed against the shelter walls. Snow crunched underfoot as someone rose to check the entrance. Everything was set for the next movement. The hunt would begin again at first light. As the last sparks flickered upward, the Neanderthals prepared to sleep. Their tools lay between them and the dark, a layer of shaped stone, fire-hardened wood, and memory. They did not mark time in years or seasons. They marked it in what was made, what was broken, and what returned with them from the hunt. And for those listening now, from Berlin or Nairobi or Tokyo, if this story holds your attention, subscribe. Your support helps keep these ancient voices alive. Before first light, the Neanderthals moved from their shelter. The sky was still black, but the snow reflected a faint blue from stars overhead. Their steps made no sound on the frozen crust. Spears were already in hand, flint points bound tight with sinew and resin. A few words were exchanged, short, low, and practical. Then they began their approach. The reindeer herd had not travelled far. The scouts had marked its last known path the night before. The hunters split silently into two groups, circling the wide slope from opposite sides. Cold air stung their faces, but they did not pause. One man stopped at a patch of frozen droppings. Still warm when first found, now crusted with frost. The herd was close. They crouched low as the terrain flattened, crawling behind wind-worn rocks and mounds of brush hardened by cold. The snow muffled nearly all movement. Ahead, faint shapes stirred. Through the pale early light, antlers rose like branches, and broad backs shifted slowly across the open field. The hunters froze. Distance would now be decided by breath control, by slow steps, by centuries of learned patience. If one animal noticed them too soon, the hunt would fail before it began. They advanced with the snow. One hunter moved forward on hands and knees, his eyes fixed on a reindeer near the edge of the herd. It stood apart, slightly limping, unaware of the silent danger nearby. The others spread wide, positioning themselves with care, forming an arc that could close quickly once the strike began. The lead man held his spear low, gripping it where shaft met blade. He waited. Every hunter waited. The wind shifted slightly, moving across their faces and toward the herd, still safe. The limping reindeer took a few steps, head down, searching through the snow crust. The signal came, not a sound, but a movement. One man rose quickly, arm already in motion. The spear flew, cutting a clean line through the air. It struck behind the shoulder. The reindeer staggered, then bolted forward. Others followed, snow exploding beneath their hooves. The trap had sprung. The hunters ran in, throwing second spears, closing the gap in long strides. Another reindeer collapsed in the rush. One man was knocked over, rolling sideways before regaining his grip. The air filled with sharp breath and snapping hooves. In seconds, it was done. The silence returned, deeper than before. The herd had scattered beyond reach. Snow drifted back into place, softening the marks left by hooves and feet. One reindeer lay still, pierced cleanly. Another kicked once, then stopped moving. The Neanderthals gathered around the fallen bodies, scanning the ridge for stragglers before kneeling to begin their work. One man moved quickly to sever the animal's neck artery, using a flint blade pulled from a hide pouch. Blood steamed against the snow. Two others began inspecting the joints, choosing where to cut for easier transport. They would not take everything, only what could be carried. Legs, organs, the best cuts. A woman joined them, carrying coiled sinew and hide wraps. She bound meat into tight bundles, while a younger hunter scraped fresh blood from his hands with snow. The tools worked as intended. The bindings held, the spears remained intact. Their hands moved fast, but without panic. This was not triumph. It was necessity. Once finished, the carcasses were covered in brush to deter scavengers. They would return for more if possible. For now, the wait was already enough. The cold did not wait, and neither did the wolves that circled far beyond the visible line of snow and stone. The return began with silence. Each hunter took a bundle, meat wrapped in hide, tied with cord, balanced carefully across the back or shoulder. Spears were reused as walking sticks, pressed into deep snow for balance. The wind had shifted again, now blowing across the trail they had used in the morning. Tracks were filling fast. The valley narrowed as they moved, and trees reappeared along the ridgeline. A few ravens circled above. One flew low, Wings tilted into the wind, then vanished. No one spoke. Their bodies moved by memory. They stepped where others had stepped. They breathed through the mouth to reduce the burn of cold air in the throat. The kill had been clean, but the work had only begun. Fat and meat were heavier in the cold, more rigid, more difficult to adjust. But they did not stop. At one bend in the path, a child's footprint still showed in the ice, left from yesterday, frozen now into the trail. A woman noticed it and stepped over it carefully. She said nothing. The sun was lowering behind the peaks, casting the ice in bands of red and white. The shelters were still a few hours away. By the time the band returned to camp, night had begun to fall. The sky was a clear sheet of darkening blue, stars already emerging above the ridges. Smoke from the fires reached low and wide, pushed by the cold air that always returned first after sunset. Children looked up as the figures appeared through the trees, stepping forward to help with the bundles. Elders remained near the fires, feeding them carefully to keep the center warm. The hunters placed the meat near the cooking stones, unwrapped it, and stepped back. One woman pressed snow to a cracked knuckle. A boy examined a spear tip, still stained but unbroken. No voices rose. There were no songs, only breath, the hiss of fire, and the movements of people doing what they had done before and would do again. Later, meat would cook, fat would melt, bone would be broken for marrow. But for now, they rested. Above them, the stars turned slowly across a sky they would never name. And you, listener, if you are here at the end of the hunt, let me know where you're listening from. Subscribe if you haven't. It helps keep this story alive in the cold. The storm did not wait. Before dawn, the wind had risen again, first in soft gusts, then in long, steady blasts that bent low the brush along the valley floor. The Neanderthal scouts returned before full light, their eyes narrowed, faces red from exposure. They brought news. The herd had moved farther than expected, pushed southeast along the frozen ridge. If they waited, the tracks would vanish. The band had little choice. The hunters wrapped their hands, checked their tools, and moved out into the wind. Snow lifted sideways in long, blinding sheets. Visibility dropped with each hill they crossed. They stayed low, using memory and the last visible tracks to guide them. The pace was different now, not careful, but determined. Each step pressed deep into loose snow, each breath taken through cloth-wrapped mouths. A dropped spear could disappear in minutes. One man walked backward, checking behind for anyone who fell behind. At one point, the group stopped beside a rock outcrop, waiting for the wind to ease. It didn't. They moved again. They knew the herd was moving too, just ahead, out of sight. Between them was the storm and survival. There would be no second chance if they lost the trail. They reached the ridge by midday. The storm had not weakened. Icy particles scraped exposed skin and stung the eyes. Even the reindeer tracks, once pressed deep into soft snow, were now faint outlines. The herd had passed this way. Droppings frozen into the crust, broken shrubs, and a disturbed snowbank marked their route. The Neanderthals paused, gathering behind a line of wind-worn stones. One man took snow and pressed it against his cheek, covering a cut left by flying ice. Another pointed toward a low saddle between two hills. The herd was likely crossing through there, avoiding steeper terrain. The group descended quickly, bodies hunched, heads low. They no longer moved in formation, but as individuals trained by the same memory. Each man read the land, searching for the next print, the next sign. Their hands stayed near the shafts of their spears, not out of fear but readiness. Every movement could be final. One hunter slipped and slid down a frozen slope, catching himself with an elbow. He stood, nodded once, and kept moving. They did not stop to speak or rest. In the white silence, the hunt was not a single moment. It was a chain of choices. The reindeer were close now. The terrain shifted again. Open snowfields gave way to a patchwork of frozen bushes, shallow drifts, and hidden ice. The lead scout raised his arm to signal a halt. He dropped to one knee beside a shallow slope where hooves had broken the crust. The tracks were fresh. Just beyond the rise, a narrow gully dropped between two ridges. If the herd had passed through it, they might still be within reach. The wind howled across the opening like a voice, constant and sharp. The Neanderthals gathered behind low stones, catching their breath in short, slow draws. There was no plan for ambush. The storm had erased strategy. They had only the hunt and the cold. One hunter moved ahead to scout the gully, stepping lightly along the frozen edge. A movement flickered in the white beyond, a flash of fur, then a set of antlers. The reindeer were still there, struggling through the deep snow. The hunter turned, raised his hand, and signaled silently. The others began to close in, forming a loose arc along the ridges. Every sound was pulled away by the wind, only their eyes remained focused, unblinking. The chase would end here. The hunters moved with urgency, but not panic. Each man descended from his position, bracing against rock and snow. The herd had seen them. A few reindeer turned uphill, slipping on the icy slope. Others ran low, cutting toward the open valley. Spears flew again. One struck low and glanced off a flank. Another buried deep behind the shoulder of a young adult. The animal stumbled, collapsed, and kicked violently. A third hunter ran to finish it. Snow blinded his path, but he aimed well. The spear landed clean. The rest of the herd vanished into the white, their tracks already softening behind them. The Neanderthals stood still, breathing heavily. They approached the fallen animal together. This kill had cost more than most. Fingers were stiff, faces raw, feet numb from the chase. One hunter fell to a knee, not from exhaustion, but from cold. He was helped up without a word. Another placed a fur across his shoulders and pressed a stone knife into his palm. The work had to begin immediately. Snow would bury everything soon. With practiced hands, they began skinning the animal, separating meat from bone, and bundling what could be carried. The storm did not wait. There was no return to camp that night. The snow thickened again, and the path back became impossible to follow. The hunters made shelter where they stood, stacking stones and brush in a narrow crease of the land. A fire was coaxed from dry moss and birch scraps wrapped in hide. Fat from the reindeer was burned for light and heat. The meat was kept close to avoid drawing scavengers. They did not speak. Each person knew the pattern. Warm the fingers, eat small pieces of meat, keep moving even when seated. One man rubbed snow on his wrists to numb pain before wrapping them in fur. Another turned a blade over in his hand, checking for cracks. These hours were not rest. They were survival between one task and the next. Wind screamed above the rocks, but inside the shelter the fire held. The carcass had been divided. The tools had survived. The men would return with what they could. Somewhere out in the storm, the rest of the herd moved on, unknowing. And somewhere far from here, someone listens. Maybe in Nairobi, maybe in Berlin. If you're one of them, subscribe. It helps this story travel through time. The fire was shallow, built low against the wind, shielded on three sides by stones stacked in a tight arc. Fat-soaked moss lit slowly, then caught, glowing orange beneath a narrow strip of birch bark. The hunters leaned close to feed it, keeping their breath low to avoid scattering the flame. Around them, the snow had hardened again. Their temporary shelter held, packed with stones, branches, and hides pressed into the gaps. Inside, the warmth was faint but real. A single haunch of reindeer meat turned on a stick above the fire. Blood hissed as it dripped onto stone. The smell filled the small space. Iron, smoke, and something sweet. One man carved thin strips from a bone joint, passing it to the next without speaking. They chewed slowly, not for flavor, but to stretch the food. A child near the back of the shelter held a warmed rock wrapped in hide against his chest. An elder pressed bone marrow into a stone bowl and stirred it with a stick. Nothing was wasted. The snow outside layered silently. Inside, the fire held steady. It did not comfort. It sustained. In that night, meat and heat were life. Nothing more, nothing less. The tools were laid out neatly beside the fire. Flint blades, bone awls, and sinew cords were kept close, within easy reach. One hunter worked with a sharpened stone, slicing away fat from the inside of a hide. He pressed it flat and scraped it until the hair pulled free. This would be used as insulation, wrapped around the feet or shoulders during the next walk home. Another man packed warm marrow into hollowed bone tubes, sealing the ends with melted pitch. These could be stored, carried, or shared later. The group worked without discussion. Every hand moved with quiet purpose. A woman stitched a tear in a child's leg wrap using a curved antler needle and sinew thread. The child did not move. Behind them, snow pressed against the outside of the shelter, making the space smaller by the hour. The fire's glow flickered along the stone walls, reflecting in the wet edges of tools and the shine of meat. No one rested fully. Each person had a task: watching the fire, packing, sharpening, or wrapping bundles of food. Outside, the world was white and unknowable. But inside, order remained. Their work was not finished. The return still lay ahead. Before sleeping, each person checked their place. Meat was stacked between layers of hide, kept off the ground with flat stones. Tools were wrapped and secured near the wall. Spears stood upright in the snow, blades turned away from passing limbs. In the dim space, the air had warmed slightly, though breath still showed in clouds. 2 hunters shared a smoked piece of reindeer, breaking it carefully so none fell to the ground. One woman turned the fire's edge with a stick, keeping coals exposed. A child beside her leaned in closer. The flame reflected in his eyes. It was not for play. He would need to know how to tend it in years to come. A few feet away, an elder rubbed pitch into a cracked hide binding, using the last of the warmth to soften the seal. Sleep would come soon, though it would be shallow. Every few hours someone would wake, stir the coals and adjust the walls. In this world, rest was never complete. It was taken in shifts, held between responsibilities. As the wind howled against the shelter, the Neanderthals closed their eyes. The fire remained. It was not protection. It was permission to close their eyes. When the fire began to sink, one man rose. His joints were stiff from cold, but his movements were automatic. He fed the fire with dry moss pulled from a wrap near his side. It smoked, then flared gently. Sparks rose, caught briefly in the roof of the shelter, then vanished. Around him, the others slept in shapes pressed tightly against each other. The warmth was shared. The man sat back, chewing on a strip of dried tendon. His eyes traced the outlines of the walls, checking for gaps. Small drifts had begun forming in the corners, carried through hairline openings. He would need to block them soon. But not yet. Outside, the storm had passed. The wind was slower now, and the trees no longer bent so sharply. He could not see the sky, but he sensed the change. In a few hours, the others would wake. The fire would be stoked again, the meat repacked, and the walk back would begin. For now, he stayed awake. Not to guard, but to watch. He listened to the breathing around him. It was steady. In this hour, beneath the weight of snow and silence, survival had no voice. Only breath. Dawn came slowly, filtered through snow and cloud. The shelter brightened by degrees until the outlines of limbs, hides, and tools re-emerged from shadow. No one stirred at first. Movement returned one person at a time. A hunter sat up, rubbing his shoulder. A woman reached for a flint blade to trim ice from the edge of her boot. The child by the fire yawned once and pulled the warmed stone closer. The man who had watched through the night handed over a bundle of wrapped meat. They would eat what they could, then walk. One elder stepped outside first, brushing aside the snow wall with a spear. The storm had ended. The sky was flat and grey, but the wind had died. Their trail was gone, buried by the night. They would need to find it again. But they had what they came for: food, fire, and tools. In the distance, scavenger tracks already circled the place of the kill. The Neanderthals prepared to move. Bundles were lifted. Spears were tested. No words marked the leaving. They did not mark endings, only continuations. And if you're still here, still listening, thank you. Your presence helps this story keep walking. By nightfall, the band had returned to their permanent shelter. Unlike the temporary camps built during the hunt, this place was larger, more established. It stood within a shallow rock alcove, partially walled with mammoth bones and covered in hide sheets weighted with stone. The fire here burned stronger, fed by dry wood kept under shelter for days. The returning hunters laid their bundles down, not quickly, but with care. Cuts of meat were passed to those already tending the fire. The others removed their outer wraps and rubbed frost from their arms. No one asked questions. The signs of the hunt were already visible: dried blood, cracked skin, tools dulled from use. One man placed his spear beside the shelter wall and sat without speaking. A woman moved to unwrap the meat and begin cooking. Children watched, waiting for the scent of heat on fat. The elder turned one of the long bones slowly, inspecting it for cracks before handing it off for marrow extraction. The night would be long, but now they were inside, together. The cold remained, but the wind stayed outside. It was not peace, but it was stillness. And for the Neanderthals, that was enough. The group sat in a rough circle, shaped not by design, but by habit. Each person had a space that changed little from one night to the next. Near the fire sat the elders and the injured, followed by the active hunters, then the younger ones, who shifted between helping and resting. In the dim light, shadows danced along the stone behind them. A boy carved at a piece of soft wood with a flint flake, copying the shape of a spear point. He did not speak. Across from him, a woman stretched a fresh hide across a flat rock, pinning it with bones to dry. The fire hissed quietly as damp meat hit the stone. The smell spread through the shelter. It was not rich, but it was known. The cold made food taste sharper, more present. A man rubbed his knee, pressing into the muscle to ease pain. Another threaded sinew through a broken sling. None of them knew the hour. They marked time by fire, by hunger, and by how far the stars had turned outside. The long night was not measured in sleep, but in how much was done before the next hunt began again. As the hours passed, the fire dimmed and the shelter grew quieter. Some slept in turns, curled beside one another beneath thick hides. Others remained awake, shifting positions, adding sticks to the embers, or turning meat to prevent burning. One woman ground dried roots between two stones, adding the powder to a bowl of melted marrow. She handed it to an elder, who ate slowly. It was warm, and that was enough. Near the shelter's entrance, a man leaned against a rock wall, rubbing his spear shaft with a scrap of hide. He ran his fingers along the lashings, checking them by feel. When he was satisfied, he placed it carefully beside the others. Outside, the wind had picked up again. As the hours passed, the fire dimmed and the shelter grew quieter. Some slept in turns, curled beside one another beneath thick hides. Others remained awake, shifting positions, adding sticks to the embers, or turning meat to prevent burning. One woman ground dried roots between two stones, adding the powder to a bowl of melted marrow. She handed it to an elder, who ate slowly. It was warm, and that was enough. Near the shelter's entrance, a man leaned against a rock wall, rubbing his spear shaft with a scrap of hide. He ran his fingers along the lashings, checking them by feel. When he was satisfied, he placed it carefully beside the others. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Before sleep came fully, the group cleaned their space. Bones were stacked beside the wall for later cracking. Tools were wiped and returned to leather wraps. Ashes were pushed into a mound so the fire could be restarted quickly. Each motion was quiet, deliberate. A young girl gathered scraps of hide and folded them into a pouch. She looked once to the woman beside her, who gave no instruction. Just a glance, then a nod. That was enough. The girl placed the pouch with the others and curled beside the fire. One hunter opened a tightly wrapped bundle of sinew and examined it for ice damage. It was still strong. He placed it beneath his sleeping mat to keep it warm through the night. Across the shelter, someone whispered once. The voice was low and brief. No one answered. There was no need. The shelter did not need voices to function. What needed to be known had already been taught. What was learned stayed in the hands. Outside, snow fell again, thin and steady. The world beyond their fire was wide and cold. Inside, they held close to each other, not in comfort, but in habit, and habit was how they endured. The final waking moments passed slowly. Each person found stillness, adjusting hides, tucking limbs, covering tools. The fire dimmed to a deep orange core. The light no longer reached the walls. It stayed low, close to the stones, and the breath of those nearest to it. In that low light, a woman reached out and touched the wrist of the man beside her. He did not stir. She moved her hand back beneath the covers and closed her eyes. The shelter was not silent. There was always sound. Crackling wood, slow breathing, the soft shift of hide against stone. Somewhere in the back of the shelter, a child murmured in sleep. No one woke to answer. The cold no longer pushed inward. Their bodies had made a pocket of warmth. That was enough. Outside, the animals moved in darkness. The wind carried their scent across the ridges. Tomorrow the hunters would wake and begin again. But tonight, they rested. Lightly, uneasily, as they had always done. And if you're listening now, wherever you are, on a break in Berlin, in bed in Tokyo, or walking in Nairobi, thank you. Leave a comment or subscribe. These stories endure only when they're remembered. Morning came with no sound. The light returned before the wind. Inside the shelter, the Neanderthals stirred slowly. Breath showed in the air, and hides rustled as bodies shifted beneath them. The fire had burned low but not out. One man leaned forward, pressed dry moss into the embers, and coaxed the flame back to life. The smoke rose straight upward. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world beyond the shelter was still and white. One by one, the group rose, stretching stiff limbs and checking their tools. A woman poured melted snow into a stone bowl. A child rubbed his eyes and reached for a warmed stone from the edge of the fire. There was no conversation. There was no need. They would move again soon. The hunt was over, but the task of living remained. Meat had been stored. Bones had been cleaned. The land remembered their presence now, in broken brush, faint bloodstains, and footprints already fading beneath fresh snow. These traces would vanish by midday, but for a moment they still held shape. The people who made them were already preparing to leave, as they always had. They never stayed long enough to be found. Outside, the landscape showed no struggle. The snow was smooth again, covering the signs of movement, death, and fire. A few scattered bones remained near the kill site, stripped clean and half buried by wind. Ravens circled above, but even they had grown quiet. The Neanderthal band moved without ceremony. Each person carried a portion of their survival, wrapped meat, tools, cords, and blades. They left behind no markers, no message. What remained would be taken by cold, animals, or time. The reindeer herd had moved on. So did the hunters. Their feet pressed into new snow, making fresh tracks that would last only a few hours. But what they carried mattered. Each cut of meat, each flint blade, each knot of sinew tied tightly around a haft was the result of effort, danger, and memory. Nothing was random. These were not wanderers. They were people following knowledge passed down not in stories, but in actions. Where to walk, how to cut, when to stop. Behind them, the snow erased their steps. Ahead of them, another valley waited. And somewhere far from that valley, you are listening and remembering. If you're still here, you've become part of this trail too. As they moved, the weight of the journey was shared evenly. The strongest carried the meat. The others carried tools, fire bundles, and hide wraps. The youngest walked in the center, guarded on all sides. They moved in single file, as they always had, with their eyes low and steps wide. Snow drifted down again, soft and steady. It filled their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Still, they did not stop. One elder pointed to a cluster of dark trees ahead. There would be shelter there, a dry spot beneath overhanging branches, a good place to rest. They would eat again, drink melted snow, and check the lashings on their packs. These pauses were not for comfort, but for rhythm. The land required it. To move too long without stopping was to risk mistake. To stop too long was to freeze. Somewhere behind them, the night shelter still stood, half collapsed and already forgotten. Its usefulness was over. The memory of its warmth had already faded. What mattered was now. This fire carried in hands, this meat tied with sinew, this breath in frozen air. There was no future to imagine, only the steps ahead. Far in the distance, shapes crossed a ridge. Reindeer, perhaps, or something larger. The Neanderthals saw it, but made no sound. It was not time to hunt again. They watched for a moment, then moved on. At their pace, they would reach the next shelter site before dark. The snow had hardened just enough to carry their weight. Beneath their feet, the ground held stories. Trails worn by other herds, other people, long gone. But the Neanderthals did not speak of them. The past was not told. It was lived again in every motion. A woman adjusted the cord over her shoulder. A man paused to tighten a hide strap across his chest. A child touched the haft of his father's spear. They did not know they would one day vanish, that their shelters would rot, their tools turn dull, their footprints disappear. They only knew that the valley had fed them once, and might feed them again. And that was enough. The group moved on, unchanged, unseen, but real. And long after their voices faded, their memory would remain in the marks they left behind. Faint, silent, almost gone, but not yet. At the edge of the valley, just before the land curved out of sight, one of the hunters turned back, only for a moment. He looked across the snow-covered plain where the herd had once stood, where the fire had burned, where the blood had dried and the meat had been carved. Then he turned again and kept walking. This was not nostalgia. It was instinct, to mark the end of one moment before beginning another. Soon the snow would cover all of it. Nothing would remain but wind and ice. But the work they had done would last, in meat that fed them, in blades that would cut again, in the rhythm of a people who remembered through action. Somewhere far away, you listened. Maybe you're walking. Maybe you're closing your eyes. Maybe you're somewhere warm, where fire is a choice, not a need. But for a time, you were here, and in a way, you walked with them. If this journey stayed with you, subscribe. It helps this path stay open. These people left no words behind, but now someone remembers. And as long as memory moves, even the coldest trail is not truly gone. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.